Welcome, everybody, to season 2 of the Cleveland State University Psychology Club podcast. My name is Kevin. I will again be one of your hosts. I am currently a student in Cleveland State University's Clinical Mental Health Counseling Master's Program, and I am joined by my partner.
I'm Madhva Galgali, and I am a graduate student in the Psychological Science program at Cleveland State University. At the time we recorded this episodes, I was a master's student in the Psychological Science program. Right now, I'm a PhD student at University of Missouri, Columbia.
Yeah, so it has been a little bit since we recorded these, and some things have changed. Yeah, as you said, Madhwa, you were at Cleveland State at that time. I still am. I was in Cleveland State University's clinical psychology master's program, and you were in the experimental psychology program, correct?
Yes, which is, I think, been now rebranded as Psychological Science program.
Okay. So yeah, now you've moved on to a PhD program. That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Right on. Well, let's get into this. So, for our first episode of season 2, we talked to Dr. Elizabeth Goncy. She is a faculty member in aforementioned clinical psychology program at Cleveland State, also a clinical psychologist. And yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about her, Madhwa?
I really like this conversation. Dr. Goncy's research is about aggression among adolescents, youth, among young adults, substance use. It also goes a lot. The research also talks about relationships and dating abuse. So I really liked this podcast conversation that we had.
Yeah, we got into some interesting topics too that aren't explicitly stated on and her faculty page and her research interests. But we talked a little bit about resiliency, the development of substance use disorders, how that kind of the interplay of that with relationships, and also identity formation across, I guess, different constructs, you could say. Yeah, it was a very interesting episode. I learned a lot from this.
Yeah, I hope you guys like listening to this episode as much as we had a good time talking to Dr. Goncy about.
And with nothing further from us, we give you Dr. Goncy. Welcome to the Cleveland State University Psychology Club podcast, Dr. Goncy.
Thank you. Glad to be here today.
Thanks for joining us.
So, we would like to start with this question that we ask almost all of our guests. How did you get into, how did you become interested in psychology?
Sure. So my background is actually a little bit different in that my bachelor's is in music. So
Wow.
Psychology came a little bit later for myself. I originally thought about actually going to school for music therapy
Okay.
because I really liked music and I liked helping people, and that's kind of where I thought about it. And I did not go that route, but eventually took an intro to psych class and realized this is what my career, my drive was missing. So I chose to go on and finished a psychology major in about 3 semesters on top of everything else, and decided to get real world experience. And I think what drove me initially and what made me most excited was understanding risk and resiliency for youth, trying to understand how some people could have the exact same experience, but their outcomes could be very different than somebody who maybe had very similar experiences but ended up becoming a stronger person or becoming much more resilient. So trying to understand that dynamic between when somebody had more troubles versus somebody who kind of rose above those problems.
So I'm sure that's a pretty broad, there's a lot in there, but I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, well, what have you found as far as what makes somebody more resilient than somebody else?
Sure. There's a lot of factors that go into that, and I think we're still trying to untangle all of those pieces in the fields that I'm most related in. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but I do a lot of work that's developmental and prevention focused. And what we do know is there are certain things that we once thought were complete deal breakers are not really as bad, depending on other things that might be available for those individuals. So, for example, growing up in a low SES environment does not necessarily lead to all doom and gloom. But if you're having some sort of support systems, a very important person in your life, a parent, a teacher, having some sort of internal personality that sort of drives you to overcome obstacles, having attachment to close people. There's a whole variety of factors that I've studied in some ways to better understand that dynamic.
We should probably ask this question a little bit before. To those who are not familiar, how would you describe your research interests as? What is it that you mainly do, and what is it that you mainly study within this area of child development and clinical psychology?
Sure. So I'm most interested in understanding development for adolescents and young adults. So I'm interested primarily in about age 10 to roughly the mid-20s. And particularly, I'm interested in something called externalizing behavior problems.
Okay.
These are things basically where individuals sort of act out in specific ways, whether it's an aggression, sort of being violent towards another person, both physically or verbally, and among other ways. I'm also interested in things like delinquent behavior, kids who do things oppositionally or kind of have problems managing their own conduct and getting along with other people because of that. I also am interested in things like substance use and how that develops across time, particularly for adolescents and young adults. And then my lens within all of that is to understand how important relationships impact the development of these problems or serve as resiliency protective factors that would prevent the start of some of these. So I've looked at these through the lens of dating and romantic relationships and looked at dating violence and subsequent victimization. I've also looked at parent-child relationships, friendships, peers, things along those lines.
So looking specifically at that time period in someone's life, what are some of the major risk factors that could contribute to somebody either not being as resilient or setting them up for more problems later in life?
Yeah, particularly in the field of externalizing behavior problems, there are a whole bunch of risk factors that we sort of know. We know certain things are more likely to happen if you are a boy versus a girl, that we know boys are tending to use more substances at earlier ages than girls. And that's interesting, sort of, but I think understanding what is it about boys versus girls that makes that difference apparent. And it might be hanging out with other delinquent pairs, other kids who are using substances. So if boys are more likely to use substances, they may hang out with friends who are doing that and then have greater access. Something like that. We also know lower parental monitoring. And so if parents aren't paying attention to their kids, they're more likely to have the opportunity to get into trouble to try substances. And we know in general parents monitor their sons less. The other thing to think about, beyond sort of a gender binary of boys and girls, is to think about gender diverse use. So those who are transgender, gender nonconforming, and the added layers of complexity that would work into that. And we see higher rates of a lot of problems like substance use or risky sexual behavior related to some of those things. So it's more of a nuanced conversation than just saying this one thing alone is a risk factor. More commonly, it's a combination of multiple things. So you can have a son who is highly monitored by parents and not having access to substances, being less likely to use it, and maybe something like religion, or having peers who don't engage in substance use. They may be less likely to then start at an early age or even start at all, versus a girl who is hanging out with an older male dating somebody. Parents are less willing to sort of pay attention to her. She may be more likely to try substances at an early age. So it's a complicated story.
How does heredity play into this? Because certainly, you could have, two children that are part of the same family, same cultural background. One of them leans more towards, using substances, perhaps in a maladaptive way, and one doesn't. What's going on there?
That's a great question. When I teach my undergrads, a lot of the questions that they ask is, well, what is heredity versus environment? And my answer always is, it's neither. It's the combination of how those two things work together. So you might actually have heredity, and we're learning a lot in the field of behavioral genetics to better understand where specifically these things are connected. But we have done a number of studies with twins and other family kinship studies where we're able to see that only a certain percentage, with something called a concordance rate, only a certain amount is actually related to genes or biology. And then there's a whole bunch that's unexplained that we're thinking is the environment. But now we're also understanding this field of epigenesis, which is the combination of how these interact together. And so it's really hard to know when an environment, is there one specific trigger that works for one individual versus another thing. If we're thinking about modeling, if parents have substance use problems, we might automatically think that that's a genetic that is being passed down. But you also have to think about the environment that a kid is growing up in. Are they seeing alcohol at a very young age? Are their parents providing more lenient attitudes towards something like marijuana? What are those other circumstances? And sometimes kids will mirror their parents and do things very similarly, but the sibling from the same family might push back against the ideals of what their parent is showing in the home and kind of rebel in the opposite way that may be healthy if the parent has been using substances, to say, I don't want to turn out like this parent.
I mean, a way that I've and I've wondered if this is correct, thought about it is, I think I've heard this sort of crude analogy. But it's useful. Is that genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger, and it's like, so there could be a genetic vulnerability to abuse substances, but maybe unless the right or wrong environment is provided, then that might not get activated. Is that the right way to think about it?
Right.
Or?
And I think the other thing to think about is that our environment, actually, we know now, impacts the genes.
Yeah.
So it's not a one-way street, so that they're interacting together. So even in a very one type of environment, it may not let those genes come through, or it may modify how that gene is imprinted in a person, and then how they pass it off to offspring.
That would be the epigenetic effect.
Yes.
So one thing, as somebody who studies social personality psychology, one thing I am interested in is looking at, are there any particular individual level personality factors that people might have that would act as a protective factor? So maybe I'm thinking in terms of Big Five, or maybe Eysenk's personality traits, or any of those smaller factors.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of research on that, and I have not done much myself. I'm aware of some of the broad implications of things, that we know that somebody who's conscientious is probably more likely to make choices that are going to reduce their risk.
Yeah.
They're going to think things through a little bit more. There's some hypotheses to suggest that extroverts may be more likely to seek out sensation, which you would see being linked with sort of delinquent behavior or substance use or aggression. But my area, I've not studied a whole lot of this. I get several students who are interested, and we have some ongoing data collection right now where we might be able to answer some of those questions.
Another question that comes from your research is identity formation. How would you describe, first thing would be, how would you technically define what an identity is, and then maybe later how it gets formed, and what are some of the processes that is involved in forming those identity?
Right. So identity formation and development is actually a really big umbrella term that covers a lot of areas. And you can think about identity development as covering many different areas. You could think about social identity. What am I like in relationships with other people? What is my identity related to my personality, my internal factors? What is my identity as related to gender or ethnicity or race or culture, religion. All of those things are part of an adolescent's growing identity. And there's some great theorists out there that have sort of looked at the combination of whether you're questioning your identity or whether you're just accepting the identity that your parents have sort of passed down to you through their actions, their values, the environment, and then whether or not you have gone through a crisis or not. So there's a whole bunch of different theorists who have looked at this. And we've actually done a little bit of studies trying to understand how identity development is related to delinquent behavior.
Okay.
The idea thinking that if you are pushing back against your parents' boundaries, but you're also in this time of confusion, you might be more likely to engage in things that would be considered atypical or that your parents wouldn't like. And that might result in doing things that you shouldn't be doing. But you can also think about identity development as sort of your gender identity or your sexual orientation, and that is a huge thing that really develops throughout adolescence. Trying to understand, does my gender match the sex I was assigned at birth? Does it match how I present myself? Is it related to the type of people that I want to date or not date or have, a romantic relationship with? And so I don't want to conflate gender identity and sexual identity because those are different and separate, but I think it's important to think about how they interact together, and that these are not things that are explicitly happening in youth. They're not thinking, okay, so what is my gender identity? But it's a process that kind of unfolds, that gets reinforced or explored throughout adolescence and young adulthood, and maybe even later.
So what are some of the you would say some of the problems that adolescents face when they go through these process? What are some of the major issues that come up, especially in people where this is a big problem for them, and they're not very sure about how and what is their identity? They're questioning things about, as you said, the values and the identities that are passed on to them either by their parents or was told to them by the society at large. So when they're going through this process of questioning, what are some of the problems that they come up with?
I think some of the biggest problems are related to people not accepting their identity for who they are. We hear this a lot with gender identity and sexual identity, which is often why people choose not to disclose that information because they're afraid they won't be accepted. Whereas other things like ethnic identity or racial identity, when you're trying to understand your family's history and culture and background, you might be more inclined to kind of go with it depending on your immigrant status. Like, how long ago did your parents or grandparents move to this country? If we're thinking specifically about U.S. adolescents, versus is this sort of been the standard and it's your family's been here for multiple generations and it's not something that you ever have to think about. So some of those problems are more of the societal barriers that get in the way of allowing kids to really figure out who they are, as well as a lot of adults trying to force kids into boxes when they're really doing a lot of exploration. And I think we see this with kids, in educational identity. Well, the standard is you go to high school, you finish high school, you go on to college. But we know only about 60% of high school students will succeed and continue on into college. What about that other 40%? So a barrier is not having open or accessible or inclusionary information for those youth because adults think they know what's best.
What are some adolescents who might be facing some of these issues doing? Because, like you said before, relationships are something that you look at in this, and they can be a protective factor. So, and I think, for many people that, are going through this time in their life, if they are at least able to maintain some kind of cohesion and stability at home, that they're probably going to be a lot better off down the road as far as, how the kinds of difficulties that they're having or not having. So when community is so important and forming an identity and feeling like that you're in the right place and you're understood and those kinds of things, what are kids that don't necessarily have that, like, how do they go about doing that?
I mean, I think it can be very tricky for those adolescents because if things aren't aligning, if their family is not meeting the identity that they're sort of thinking about, or the school system is excluding discussion of that identity, or if their peers are not accepting, they might turn to another one of those systems. Like if my family's not accepting me, maybe I'm going to learn and find the group at school that seems to accept me. And that might be a positive thing. You find a good group of peers who are involved in pro-social, helping behavior that might be beneficial to society. That might be a protective thing, versus if you're finding the group, well, I don't belong anywhere, so I'm going to go with this quote-unquote outcast group, who might be the kids that are engaging in substance use or vandalism, and finding a sense of belonging there. So you can see this kind of going either direction. We also find that, and if you would have asked me this 20 years ago, my answer would be very different, but we're seeing youth are exploring their identities more so online, using a lot of online blogs, social media, Google searching to try to find information that will help them, because they can then learn there are other people in the world who are similar to them, and that can connect them to sort of explore and answer some of those questions that they're experiencing.
Yeah, something that I'm very interested in is sort of the, how some of these externalized behaviors, how they begin and how they're kind of like maintained throughout the lifespan, and how they're potentially altered or intervened upon. And, it seems that, let me go back a little bit. So if you, for example, if you're ever in a recovery community, so people that have had substance use disorders and they're trying to get better, a very common theme there is, people saying something along the lines of I felt like I never fit in. So, and it's very typical, I think, that regardless of how stable or cohesive your environment is when you're a teenager, you probably don't feel like you fit in. But it seems like that people that manage to get help through that and then kind of move on to the next stage of their life, maybe they aren't engaging in as many maladaptive behaviors. So, but if you don't feel like you fit in, there's kind of I've been looking at this idea of shame and how that plays into maladaptive behaviors, or abusive substance use, and how that's also a barrier to help seeking, or effective interpersonal adaptive I guess functioning. So I'm not really sure what my question is, but it seems like that, somehow, if you don't really feel like you're a part of, and you kind of, like you were saying, you're going to turn to a different group that maybe of other people who also don't feel like they're a part of. And, there might be just things that are happening in those groups that would be systematically would impede somebody from doing what they needed to do to, I guess, address whatever issues might come about. And that, I don't know if I'm being cohesive with how I'm saying that.
I think what you might be getting at is that when people don't have this feeling of belongingness, maybe they turn towards other groups which provide them with the belongingness, but the side effect of that is that they are maybe into delinquent behaviors, and you have to engage into that as a way to get that fulfill that need to belong.
Yeah, that kind of becomes this belonging around feeling like you don't belong.
Yeah. What do you think about that? Maybe, especially it's again, within the social psychology literature, there is a lot of research about rituals and how these rituals are very important to show what is called as creds, which is credibility enhancing displays. And maybe if I look at this from social psychological lens, it would be like, oh, you feel like an outcast, maybe either because you have social anxiety, or maybe you're not well trained how to speak with people and stuff like that. Then you go to this other group and they say, you can enter our group, but this is what we do. Maybe we are into drugs or something like that. And you would say, okay, as long as I be in this group, I'm willing to do that part.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be that explicit, that they'll be clear, this is what we do. But I think there is almost kind of a grooming and a testing the water when you do enter a new group to understand what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that we do know that adolescence is a huge time of exploration with horrible brain development. It's not done. The prefrontal cortex is still developing. We're impulsive. We're not making good decisions that are rational. So that combined with these groups that maybe provide the sense of belonging may not always allow adolescents to make some of those best decisions.
Yeah.
And this is actually something that there's a huge preponderance of evidence to support that we really see from about 0 to age 12 or so, really low levels of externalizing behaviors. In some cases, like aggression, substance use, things like that. But then it spikes from 12 to 18. And there's a huge group of kids who do this exploration. They try things out. They maybe hang out with kids to where they feel like they belong. And then something happens around 18, 20, and it stops. And so what Terry Moffat, who's been one of the key figures in this area, has decided is that there's adolescent limited externalizing behavior problems where things happen for a very short amount of time, but it's rather normative because it's happening to a lot of individuals. There are obviously some kids who just never go through that, and they just sort of kind of keep on the straight and narrow through most of it. And there's also some kids who from the get-go have had a really hard time. So from very early on in toddlerhood, you can start recognizing this pattern, and they're sort of what she would refer to as life course persistent, meaning that they're always going to be people who have problems managing and following rules, thinking about how to get along in society, rule breakers, non-law abiding citizens, and we often see that is our criminal population for adults. So there is some support to sort of look at this as adolescence, it almost being somewhat normative to test some of those boundaries.
I would be interested to know if there's some attachment theory dynamics going on in terms of having secure attachment versus insecure attachment styles as you were treated by your parents, and maybe then that gets transported into how we see our groups as. Do you think that could be at play? I'm not sure.
There absolutely is. There's a whole bunch of research looking at how attachment style has, it actually transfers. There's a body of work called an internal working model where you develop what you've thought about, and you don't really explicitly do this, it's all unconscious or subconscious, where the experiences that you've had with your parents or primary caregivers, that remains a rather salient piece. But the evidence really has been that sort of transfers primarily to a dominant romantic partner as you become a young adult, late adolescent. And so there's a whole bunch of research done on romantic attachment. And we do know that those who have a more insecure or avoidant attachment, somebody who might be more prone to jealousy, feeling like they aren't connected with their partner, that is actually related to a whole bunch of problematic behaviors. Lower relationship satisfaction, higher rates of emotional and physical abuse. And then if there's a discrepancy between the two individuals who are dating, say one is secure and the other one is insecure, there might be some hope that you can realign your attachment with somebody that is providing this corrective experience. But if you have multiple people who have insecure attachments and they're together, that's often could be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, that's a good segue into some of the research that you do on violence. I think you do mostly research on violence within interpersonal settings, especially romantic relations. Right. So one thing that interests both me and Kevin is, how do you define violence? I know there is an obvious physical violence, but there is also other kind of violence which is not very obvious. So how do you define that? And how is it that people might have how do you provide map to people knowing that maybe they are being victims of this type of violence?
Sure. So, that's a big question in the field.
Yes.
And we don't all agree with what term we should use, whether we should say violence or aggression or abuse.
Yeah.
And I think people tend to not like the term violence because it implies only physical.
Okay.
That there's an injury, that there's some kind of an attack that is violent, pushing, shoving, hitting, something that you could think of as typically domestic violence. However, when I study romantic relationship abuse or dating abuse, I'm interested in a much broader field of behaviors. So I am interested in that physical outcome that's going to result in injuries. But the prevalence of that in adolescents and young adults is rather low. Physical violence is only going to happen in about 10 to 20% of those relationships. Whereas other forms of violence, such as emotional or verbal abuse, psychological abuse, these would be things like yelling at a partner, doing something to make them jealous, insulting them with put downs, controlling where they are and who they're with, we see that type of behavior is much more common. And there's some studies that have said it's upward of 90% of those relationships in adolescence and young adulthood where this has happened at least once.
Okay.
So that is, you go from this very specific, like I can see a bruise or see somebody who's hit, to sort of this much more open-ended thinking about abuse. So we've started to look at psychological and this verbal or emotional type of abuse, but that's not where the story ends. We can also think about threats that are given to partners. If you do this, I'm going to leave you. If you don't do this, I'm going to hurt myself. And that can be very overwhelming to a person who feels like somebody else's life might be on the line. We can also think about things like financial abuse. So if somebody has money and they're sort of using or relying on them to kind of get what they need, and we see this more commonly in more domestic partnerships, but we do see some of this emotional abuse, or financial abuse happening among younger couples. That might be something to think about as well, that if you feel like you can't be in a relationship or can't get out of a relationship because it would financially hurt you. And then there's other forms, such as sexual violence, that can happen within a relationship or a prior relationship, from unwanted kissing and touching to rape. And so I think there's a much broader definition when I'm thinking about what would be violence in a relationship.
So in respect to that, what you just described as like the nonviolent types of, or the non-physical violence,
Yeah.
how, once you throw substances into that mix, like how does that contribute to that?
Right. So we do know that there tends to be higher rates of a lot of these things when you have couples who are engaging in substance use, either together or not together. So there's some research that suggests that we might see individuals who have been drinking or engaging in substances might have some discrepant views about what's actually happening. You lose your memory of maybe what happened, you're not as aware, and if you're feeling kind of jealous towards somebody and they're talking to another person in a social setting, are you going to then come back at them later and control them with words? So there is some of that. But I think where some of the research also has evidence is when there's a discrepancy in the amount of substance use between the individuals in a couple. So if one person uses a lot of substances and the other one doesn't, that can actually lead to more strife, because there's a broader disagreement about how these two view and value things in life. And we particularly see this among couples who have had similar drinking or drug use patterns, and then one of them changes. Maybe the female becomes pregnant and they therefore decide they're not going to be using drinking anymore or whatever it is, whereas the male has no reason to specifically make a change in that behavior. So they might see these discrepancies, and then their values, their social systems, all of those things change, and that can also lead to instances where abuse might be more common.
Do you see differences in, aside from the one you just mentioned, but like if we flip that and let's say that the female is using more substances than like the male in the relationship?
Yeah.
Like how does
It
how
seems
does that play out?
the gender doesn't seem to matter in that case. So it's really more about the discrepancy than who's the user and who's the non-user.
Okay. Have you noticed or know of any discrepancies as far as what substances are being used?
That's a great question. I think the majority of research has been done on things like alcohol and marijuana, and we have a lot less evidence for other things like methamphetamines, opioids, heroin, inhalants, other things that adolescents or young adults might use. We tend to really focus on the two big, alcohol and marijuana. But
I mean, just from, I think the average person on the street would probably associate more erratic behavior and violence with alcohol than they would say marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I'm wondering, at that age, if that, are people that use alcohol like more violent than people that use marijuana?
Yeah, and that's actually something I'm not 100% sure in a broader spectrum, and I think some of this could be related, that thinking might be related to some attribution errors that we make, sort of thinking about that we see more violent behavior among people who are drinking because they're more boisterous, they're louder, they might seem like they might be more violent. And it might be an implicit bias that we sort of have to make that assumption, and I'm less familiar with that literature just in general.
That's interesting. When people who are at risk and who have been identified at risk for either substance abuse or delinquent behavior and things like that, what are some of the factors that they or some of the steps that they can take to get back on course and leave the problematic externalizing behaviors that you talked about?
Yeah, so there's actually been quite a bit of evidence or literature that has looked at sort of different ways that we could help kids who have been identified at risk. And we can think about it from a number of different factors. You could think about it like an individual intervention where you maybe work with a youth about how to help with self-regulation and emotion regulation and giving them new strategies.
Yeah.
If they've been primarily using maladaptive ones like substance use or avoidance, that maybe we teach them how to cope with those things and how to identify situations where they may need adaptive strategies. We can also think about using more family approaches, so depending on the age of the kid, working with the parents so that they can understand the causes of some of these problems and how they can become more involved in a kid's life, better monitoring, understanding if the discrepancy might be related to the parents' beliefs. So if a kid's getting in trouble for fighting at school, but then you talk to the parents and they say, well, if a kid calls you a mean name, you go ahead and slug them. So you're dealing with this discrepant, the school is saying we don't tolerate violence, with the parents sending the message, this is how you should resolve that problem.
Yeah.
So sometimes having conversations to figure out where that communication is breaking down and finding ways to make everybody happy. We can also think about broader interventions as well. If there's a big issue in a school setting, there's actually been some really interesting work that they did this across 4 different states where they looked at individuals who were aggressive in the school, in middle school, so 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, but then also found out those who were maybe popular or influential. And they really focused on doing some intervention with those kids. And what they found was that if you can teach the influential, aggressive kids new strategies, and then they start using those, their influence then changes the aggressive kids who are maybe less popular or not as influential, and it can change the entire climate of a school. So you have to think about multiple ways of approaching this, and that sometimes it's not one or the other, or maybe it's a combination.
Yeah, when you mentioned, finding ways that you gave the example of, parents maybe suggesting that their kids, fight back basically in a situation like that, but then also having, the parents be the ones that are changing their behavior or maybe getting more involved with the adolescent. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, a lot of adolescents, that's really probably the last thing they want is to be more involved with their parents or listen to what their parents are telling them. So you kind of answered my question as far as like, oh, well, if you get influential adolescents at school that change their behavior, then that's where the influence can also happen, which, I mean, makes a lot of sense.
So you really have to think about the age of a kid. So you're more likely to have better luck with parents with early adolescence, so those like 10, 11, 12, 13, middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But about that time, parents are still pretty influential in the kids, and kids will still listen to them. But around that transition into high school, the importance of parents and sort of the internal dialogue of adolescence drops off, and that dialogue with peers and what peers are going to think about things matters so much more. Parents can still be part of that, but I think at that point, that's when peers are starting to overtake.
I think also, like, you know, beyond parents, just adults in general, you know, I remember, like, when I was a kid, they had this, like, DARE program in school. And from what I've heard that was found maybe not so effective.
Yeah, the research actually says DARE was not effective at all.
Yeah, and it's like, I would think that there's probably a certain subset of kids that maybe hearing those kinds of messages from, you know, really just any adult at all, but especially like the square adults at school, that might even make them want to try drugs.
Perhaps. I mean, I think that's a good point. There's not great prevention strategies yet that we know of for reducing drug use. You bring in a law enforcement who did DARE at my school. You know, we had a police officer from the local community came in and presented the program. That might have worked in a predominantly white parochial school, but if you think about bringing law enforcement into an inner city school where there's predominantly black children who don't trust institutions such as the police, that's going to backfire and it might not work. So I think it's important to think about all of those dynamics when we're preventing or designing prevention programs.
Yeah, like, I don't think you could get further away from the mentality of a teenager than to, I mean, yeah, like some would be receptive to it, but I just think that there's like the people for whom I would guess that, you know, drugs and alcohol and that type of behavior, vandalism, whatever it is attractive in the first place, and then you bring in a police officer. I mean, like, I maybe this is just me, but like, I can't imagine those types of kids.
Parents don't work, so we'll bring in the law.
Right, and I think a lot of this is everybody assumes somebody else is having these conversations, whether it's substance use, whether it's sexual health, whether it's socio-emotional. The school assumes the parents are doing it. The parents assume the school is doing it. And if neither of them are doing it, where are kids learning this information? Well, they go to the internet, they go to their peers, and we know there's rampant misinformation that peers share with each other, and the internet is just there can be very good information, but there's also a lot of really bad information there too.
Yeah, that's so it seems that then instead of having somebody with authority and stuff like that, at that point of time within their developmental period, it's better to have somebody who is really influential within their peer group to give those sorts of messages that could potentially prevent them from engaging in substances that could be harmful for them or engaging in behaviors that could be harmful for them.
Right. And it needs to be an ongoing conversation. So bringing in the one guest speaker who was involved in or was arrested for drunk driving after they graduated high school and having them come back and give like a one-time speech, that might impact a little bit, but it needs to be an ongoing conversation so that it's continuing to be part of what's happening, and that it isn't just thought about like, oh, because it's prom, let's think about this now.
One thing I would be interested in is there difference between those who are religious versus non-religious to the extent that they use the substance?
Yeah.
And to what extent that it causes friction within them when they do use it? Because my guess, I do not know much research. If you're born and brought up in extremely religious home environment, maybe you would be more attracted towards doing this. But if you're like probably within moderately religious environment, maybe you had some freedom and stuff like that, maybe you might not be very interested in doing it.
Right, and I think there's a wide variation among that. So if there are people who are very extremely religious and they really rely on religion to make all of their decisions, and therefore they also rely on their parents, you might see that they're going to stick with that religious and really they will avoid circumstances or environments or people who might open up those opportunities because they're so within this religion background. But then you do see maybe there are some people who have that I'm going to push against what my parents said, and I want to try these things because whether it's an explicitly said, my parents always said don't do this, so I'm going to do this, or if it's more like I'm an adolescent with an undeveloped prefrontal cortex, impulsive behavior, and peers who are suggesting this. Maybe that would be why I would try it. So not having yourself rooted really strongly someplace could really test those limits or those values in situations that might be a little riskier.
Well, I think that there's that could also play into, if there's like a adolescent who is prone to more delinquent types of behavior and is kind of has a rebellious attitude and is associating the religion that they were brought up in that maybe they're not too crazy about, and with you're coming down on me, this is what you're saying I should be doing, so I'm lumping my parents together, the religion together, the society together, and it's all this thing that's telling me I can't do what I want to do, that's actually giving me some relief or some joy. Then it just becomes this huge it's me against the world, or it's me and my friends against the world. And then it's well, how do you get through to that? And then on top of that, let's fast forward, let's say 10 years, and maybe you've picked up a substance use disorder, and maybe you find yourself trying to get treatment, and then you find yourself in an organization that's saying you need to pray to get better. Then it's just kind of really, is this when am I ever going to get away from this?
Right.
Yeah. I remember I started drinking coffee as way to rebel, because drinking black coffee is seen as completely weird without sugar and milk. As everybody in my family was drinking coffee with milk and sugar, and I was I'm going to do the opposite of what they're doing. So I picked up the substance. I'm not sure if it's abuse, but I do drink a lot of coffee. But
you're also a graduate student, so there's a balance there.
That's true.
Well, the good thing is, from what I've seen, is that pretty much there's a preponderance of evidence that suggests that coffee, at least black coffee, is actually pretty good for you if it's consumed in moderation. So,
right.
Yeah.
It's the sugar in the milk that is not good for your waistline.
What I'm curious about is are you aware of? I know this kind of goes a little bit beyond what you're interested in, but as far as treatment for substance use disorders, are there things that are more effective for teenagers versus adults, or?
Right. In terms of substance use disorder, and this comes from some of my training and background, is prevention is probably one of the biggest things that we should really do for adolescents and teens. There is a good amount of evidence to suggest that teens who start using substances before the age of 14 have a significantly higher risk of actually going into a treatment facility for a substance use disorder when they're 18 or older. It's almost 40 or 50% higher than a teen who starts to use substances after this magical cutoff of 14. So really getting adolescents to maybe even delay initiation could be one of those big things that could reduce the rates of substance use disorders later. That's not going to get everything, because clearly there's still a good portion who start later in life, and that could be something a different intervention might be useful for. There's also been some really cool research, but it's very time intensive, very expensive, called wraparound treatment services, and this is pretty much where you combine services from multiple agencies in a community to really reach out to kids who are struggling with primarily delinquent or substance use kind of issues, where you're making sure that they're connected in every possible way to sort of get what they need. And you can see how this could be very time intensive, very expensive. And then if you have a kid who's not invested, it can almost seem wasteful.
Yeah. You mentioned before that a lot of the delinquent behavior kids seem to maybe even grow out of it by the time they hit 18. It's the 12 from 18 is the real hotbed of that kind of activity. I mean, is there any way that we know to identify, other than just kind of like the eyeball test of saying like, you know what, I think this kid, like, I think he might be okay when he turns 18, and I think he's just going to outgrow this stuff, versus, okay, this person like really needs help, and
Right.
they are really at risk for having more problems down the road.
I think some of it is looking at the history of everything. You know, if they were having problems before the age of 12, then again, that's sort of going to increase their risk for having more of a life course persistent sort of following. But I think when you sort of get to some of those adolescents, looking at other things, are they becoming withdrawn? Do they also have some sort of internalizing issues? That are harder to identify sometimes? Are they feeling depressed or anxious? Are they not feeling like they're belonging? Has there been indication for wanting to harm oneself? Think thoughts of suicide. Those might be other things that would help us identify kids who maybe need more assistance and that time. You also might want to think about how this impacts other areas in their life. Their academic achievement, is there a significant change in that as a result of what's happening? Is it a drastically changing peer group? Are they sort of isolating themselves from activities that they once enjoyed doing and finding other things to do with their time? And that might indicate depression or an increase in a group that might be more deviant than previous.
As far as
Go ahead.
as far as the relationships and being a protective factor, especially around this time, I mean, do they all, I shouldn't say all, but do familial ones, do they carry different weights, or can different members of the family have like a different amount of influence on a kid? I mean, for example, if there's someone like an adolescent who's engaging in delinquent behavior, and the parents maybe are doing some of the same themselves, and maybe like can't be relied on to be a positive influence, is having grandparents or aunts or uncles that are really there for that kid, can that be just as protective as or does it have to be the parents?
It doesn't have to be the parents. We've actually gotten away from this focus on the parents and a lot of the literature, and focus on what we call VIPs, or very important people. And this could be an aunt and uncle, a grandparent, an older sibling, a teacher, a band director, somebody who you really feel that connection with, that might allow you to see the possibilities in a different way. So if the parents aren't the ones who are being those VIPs, it's not all it doesn't necessarily mean that that child is lost.
I was just going to ask the question that plagues our generation, which is like, how much, what is the role of social media, and like either like compounding on whatever negative effects of it is. Maybe people might not feel, especially teenagers, might not feel that they belong just because of the social media. Or maybe social media could be used for some other things, like campaigns where you could like help people give information. So
Right. So a lot of the things that I've discussed, and particularly into some of the relationship violence stuff, we really have to think about social media as sort of being another medium for a lot of these things to happen. So you could think about controlling a person by having location tracking on a cell phone, which happens, and that's not healthy.
Yeah.
You might also want to think about anonymous messages that are posted on blogs, and information that can get set out into the cyber world and may or may not be true, and how that might impact an adolescent who's not feeling like they belong, and they're being picked on, victimized by an anonymous, or maybe not anonymous. Other people might know who this person is that's doing the posting. So all of those forms, like threatening behavior, emotional and verbal abuse, financial abuse, whether it's in a romantic or dating relationship, or even in peer relationships, that social media and instant gratification that comes from all of this new technology is really changing the dynamic, where it used to be kids can come home from school and sort of be protected from that day-to-day bullying or controlling that's happening, but now it's a 24/7 world where it actually never stops, and that can really, I think, be much more detrimental.
My understanding is that this has much more adversely affected women as compared to men, because the bullying that happens within the women peer circle is much more emotional, and that makes it much more easier to happen through social media, while when it comes to men, it's usually like physical bullying and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'm less familiar with that, but I could really see, we do know that rates of like things like depression and anxiety are much higher among women, and
Yeah.
we know that social media use is also related to depression and anxiety, that the more you tend to use social media. So there's some interesting moderators to think about the amount of use, the gender, and sort of the outcomes.
Where's the thinking on those differences in gender as far as the internalizing versus the externalizing? So, I mean, I've heard it suggested that, men and boys might also be experiencing, depression and anxiety similar to women and girls, but they're engaging in these externalizing behaviors to sort of like ameliorate the effects of that, whereas maybe women and girls are engaging in more, like relational kind of abuse or maladaptive sort of practices.
A lot of that might have to do with gender socialization. So little girls are told it's okay to cry, it's okay to be emotional, whereas that same message is not shared with little boys, that, you skinned your knee, get up and move on. It's not okay to cry. These are messages that either are explicitly given or are implicitly interwoven within our society, where you don't see models of men expressing emotions in the same way that women might, or the acceptance of some of that. And then it also has to do with, engaging with the same-sex parent and sort of seeing how they react to situations. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's how we tend to form, our ability to cope with things. So it could be that we're seeing this gender disparity, and that girls are more diagnosed with internalizing depression, anxiety, and the boys more with the externalizing side of things, but they could just be different reactions to the same kinds of situations. And it's what society has labeled.
So one thing we both were curious about is like, you use very interesting methodologies to study these things. So could you elaborate on that? So that because you use not only survey methods but things like interviews and stuff like that. So how does that work within your lab?
Yeah, so we actually have a couple of different studies right now where we're using mixed methodologies, where we are doing surveys where we're asking young adults to report on certain things, like their symptoms of depression, how much substances they've used, their personality, their attachment with romantic peers. And then we've also had followed this up with a couple different strategies that we're using to collect more information. So one of those is to do a qualitative interview where we have somebody sit down one-on-one and we ask them questions that are open-ended and intended for us to get a better understanding of what they think about things. So we might ask something like, how do you define a healthy dating relationship? How do you define an unhealthy dating relationship? And sort of allow them to expand on those things so that we can better understand sort of the perceptions that people might have about what's healthy and unhealthy for multiple reasons. One, we can then link it to some of that internalizing or externalizing symptomatology, but then it can also help us better understand what adolescents and young adults are thinking if we're going to develop a prevention or intervention program, to use the language that they're thinking to overcome common myths. One of our studies, we're also doing this with couples, and couples who have been dating together for at least a month are invited to come in. They do interviews, they do a survey, and then we also have them do some tasks together. So they fill out some surveys where they read different vignettes. We're trying to understand the perceptions of when we can identify dating abuse when it's happening, whether the perpetrator is a male or a female, and then also whether or not that relationship is a same-sex couple or opposite-sex couple, and whether we see those things as being the same or different. So in the couples, both individual will read the vignette and answer a series of questions. Is this typical? Is for young adults? Is this, do we think dating abuse is happening here? If so, what kind of form? Is intervention needed? Who needs the intervention? And then the really cool part of the study is that we give the vignettes to them and we video record them discussing the vignettes together and coming up with a new answer. So not only are we getting their individual perceptions, but we're also seeing the dynamic of how they're discussing these things together and whether or not one person can influence the thinking of another person in either a better or worse way as we're trying to think about these things. And anecdotally, what I can tell you, we've done this with about 20 or so couples. Sometimes they'll be reading through the vignette and they'll be like, hey, that's what we do. And it's almost an intervention in a way to kind of get a sense of having them think more introspectively about what's happening. We don't leave them on that bad note. We also do just, some fun tasks with them together where they get to plan an all expenses paid vacation. And from that, we're able to actually then see more typical interactions to see, is there a more dominant person? Is there somebody who controls a little bit more? Can they use, affiliative humor to kind of enhance the conversation, or are they more aggressive or emotionally abusive? So you can look at that and then tie that to all this survey and this interview data and get some really interesting results.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
We're also about to start another project where we're going to do some virtual participant observations. Basically, we're working with a group of young teens, and we're going to ask them if we can sort of follow them on their social media and sort of see what they're accessing, and asking them to send us some specific information. For this one, we're really interested in the sexual health information that adolescents are receiving online and what they're getting, to sort of understand, if you're not getting it at school or from your parents, you're getting it online, what is the quality and content of this information? So I think sort of thinking innovatively about how to access a population that doesn't want to just sit and fill out surveys.
Yeah. Any advice for the undergrads?
Any advice for the undergrads? Yes. I think psychology is a big, broad field. It's really a tough a tough field to find where you belong. I mean, a lot of people are naturally drawn to psychology, and I think that's great because people are fascinating and there's so much to learn. But what my advice to undergrads might be is to get involved early, whether it's volunteering with an agency or with a population that you're interested in, just to sort of get an idea. Maybe you think you want to work with individuals who have autism, and then you start working with them and you realize either I like this or I don't like this.
Yes.
So getting boots on the ground, actually doing things with people who have something that you maybe want to work with. If you're thinking graduate school, finding some way to get involved in research. And the earlier you can do this, the better. And that research can be with people in the psychology department, but it could also be more broadly speaking. So there's a lot of groups, other departments that might be doing research that could be just as beneficial. And finding ways to work with people who are doing human research would be ideal, unless you're doing something more biology related, neuroscience. The other advice I would say is to seek out advice from people who are doing what you want to do and asking them how did they get there, and to also look for jobs that maybe you want and read the qualifications of what's required to get that job. And that might help focus you to think about what kinds of experiences you need.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much all we got.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
For
For joining us.
Yeah, thank you.